Welcome to The Other Worlds, where we talk to authors of fantasy, supernatural, and paranormal stories. Let's open the portal and meet our guest. Just a note that we did have some audio issues while recording, and there may be occasions when voices cut out briefly. Hello, I'm Sandra Tan, and I am joined today by Markus Redmond. And Markus is just a fascinating person. He has studied acting in Hollywood when he was in high school. He's gone on to have film credits and TV credits in NYPD Blue, Dougie Houser M.D., Mad About You, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Murder One, Fight Club, and many other shows. And you also have sold movie scripts. You've been in indie films. And now you have your debut novel, Blood Slaves, coming out in July. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sandra.
Oh, it's great to actually have a chance to chat with you because you have such a fascinating background. And I wondered how your experience in film influenced you when it came time to write Blood Slaves.
Um, wow. I think it was all influence. You got to remember, I hadn't written a book before. Um, so I really didn't know what I was doing. It was in the pandemic and I got very angry and this story came to me and I put it down on paper. I had only known how to write scripts. So in my head, a book was just a script with more description. And that's kind of how I embarked. So it was completely coming from a visual place from the get go. And then after I got representation, folks sat down and said, "This isn't exactly how you write a book." And so I had to learn the difference of it, but it was always coming from a place of visual impact. I wanted people to be able to envision what they were reading. I remember early in saying I wanted to write a book that people who don't read would read because it would have a cinematic quality to it. So I was always seeing things in my head as I was writing. And that just comes from my background. It's just how I naturally go through story.
Yeah, I think that the visual component does come through clearly in your writing, and I think that it has this great advantage because you really feel immersed in what's going on, like you can actually, see and touch what's happening around you. I felt very much like I was there, and that's both. That has pros and cons because this is a very this is a very intense story. You told me right at the beginning, read the content warnings. You're dealing with really heavy subject matter. So I wondered, when you approached writing some of the subject matter, did you have any reservations or concerns about some of the content that you were including? Was there anything there where you kind of like had to take a step back and think it through or discuss it with somebody to see if you wanted to include it? Or did you feel confident in tackling the heavy subject matter that you chose to include?
I was very confident about it. Here's the thing. We live in a time, you remember, I started this in 2020, and President was Trump. So it's a little odd to me that the book is now coming out and he's president again. But there's a lot of sort of, I think they call it slavery apologists. There's a lot of making light of what slavery was on this land. There's a lot of, Africans, they are the ones that sold the slaves. A lot of that. It's a lot of making light of what slavery was. And I didn't take creative license when it came to that stuff. unfortunately, that's how it went. And I do understand that it's difficult, and I do understand that it's triggering. But it's the reality of what happened. And I feel as though if we're going to talk about slavery, we should talk about slavery as it was. And that's just sort of the sort of principled answer. In terms of story, I thought it was important to accurately depict it because the truth of the matter is if you make the conscious decision that you have to die and then come back a monster that subsists on blood, which means you have to kill to live, things have to be pretty bad. It can't just be like, oh, well, I stubbed my toe the other day. Things have to be really bad to make that decision. And unfortunately, they were. I tell everyone, don't go into it if it's going to be bad for your mental health. I completely respect that take. I totally understand it. I don't want anybody feeling anything they don't want to feel. I don't want anyone to read anything that they don't want to read or something that's going to affect them in a negative manner. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But in order to tell the story as effectively as possible, I had to tell the truth of slavery. And unfortunately, I didn't make that stuff. I mean, some of the things that happened are actually documented to have had happened to some of the enslaved. So it's an unfortunate truth.
And you have a friend with a PhD in slavery studies. You mentioned this in an interview with your editor. So you researched this. Were there things that you learned during that research process that surprised you or that you weren't aware of previously?
Yes. In fact, as horrific as what's in the book is, there are lots of stuff that I left out because it was worse. So the book is set in 1710. At that point in time, slavery hadn't yet become an industry. There wasn't in America yet because we didn't get to America until 1776. So, Barrow, Monroe, all of these folks, they still considered themselves to be British. So it's kind of the childhood of slavery during this time. But it was still really horrific, maybe more horrific than the time that we sort of are used to seeing slavery in, which is in the 1800s. By that time, it's like, oh, okay, well, we have to make sure that the bucks don't get damaged too bad because they're important to what's going on. There were just things that happened that were done things that were done to infants, children, cannibalism, just savagery for sport. And it always sort of affected me in this very odd way. Those of African descent are described as savage because, there was a lot of violence in being enslaved, and it was unimaginable, most of it. And even talking to you, I have a hard time describing it because it was just so horrendous. And that surprised me because it taught me the savagery of humanity. We are capable of doing horrendous things to one another, all because of skin. Weird.
Yeah, it's quite eye opening, even with what you did cover in the book. And I think for myself, it's an ongoing education because I'm Canadian. My husband's American, so
Mhm.
I've told people, even though we learn things about the United States in school, obviously, um, I didn't really understand the impact and the current impact of
Yeah.
slavery in the United States until I live here. And even then, it's an ongoing process because um, once you start doing the math and you realize, like, we're really not talking that long ago when it comes to the Civil War. It's not that many generations ago, and and so it's an eye opening. It was eye opening for me, to begin the journey of beginning to learn about about the history here, and I feel like I've probably barely scratched the surface. And then there's also there is sort of the way that things are presented in film, and sort of like the conditioning in terms of how we have portrayed certain things that only goes so far in terms of really addressing the issues. And it, so I'm curious because you were saying you were talking about the book taking place in 1710. And you were talking about the situation involving slavery at that time was different than it was later. It was
Mhm.
it was really early on in that, and so I'm assuming that's why you chose that. Because I was wondering when I was reading it why you had chosen 1710. Is it because it was a pivotal, it was early enough to be before it really became the slavery was kind of uh, became an industry, for lack of better term?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's exactly why I picked that time. I wanted to I wanted to do it before the United States was a thing, um, because I knew going in that I was creating a series, and I knew what I wanted to do on an alternate history sort of situation. So I didn't want to be in the United States. I just wanted to be in the colonies. Um, and also, from the things that I read, it was more savage in the 1700s than it was in the 1800s. And I also feel as though the 1800s, like, right before the Civil War, it's kind of where we live creatively in slavery narratives. It's kind of the same thing. It's the cotton fields, you know, it's almost the Civil War, and that's the big story. Civil War isn't really the story of the enslaved. So I wanted to focus in on this one slave who rises and frees his people, um, without it having to be disrupted by, the very colonized story of this impending war. I wanted it to be about him and his people and what he did in order to get free.
You do center on, pardon me, and let me know if I'm saying it wrong. You do center on Quadzo in the story. Is
Yes.
that correct? Okay. And then you have Rafazi.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's it. Nailed it, Sam.
Well, but I'm always going around and trying to get audio on things before I'm trying to say words, because when you're reading it, you don't know for sure.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, so yay. But these two create this interesting um, partnership in a way. But it was fascinating to me, the range of characters that you have in the story. Rafazi is a coward, a self-confessed coward, and yet, in a way, his cowardice served him, and it kind of reminded me in a way of Gertie, in the sense that it was more comfortable to stay with what she knew
Mm.
than it was to pursue change. And I know that she thought about it from the perspective of what was right and what was wrong, what was good and what was evil. But it did strike me that although they had different motives, in some ways, they were both inclined to go with self-preservation rather than taking risk. And I wonder whether that was at all intentional or whether that's just something that occurred to me that maybe wasn't intended.
Oh no, it was definitely part of the makeup. Um, Full disclosure, my mother and my grandmother uh, had a very similar relationship to Gertie and Ozzy. They both wanted the same things. They saw things very differently. Um, they were like this, they're gods all the time, but they wanted the same thing. Um, you know, the thing with Gertie's lost everything. Everything. Um, the only thing she has to hold on to is her unborn child and Willie, who becomes Plaza. Um, any deviation from that, as far as she's concerned, a certain death. She doesn't see any other way out. And the Ramangan blood is just evil. And, Gertie's a religious woman. She grew up with a faith that she clings to because it's all she has left of her ancestry. Her family is gone. There's nothing else for her to hold on to. And she's stuck in this situation that there is no out. There's no out. The only thing that gave her any semblance of peace was Willie. And now he's saying, I gotta go do this evil thing so we can be free. And it just doesn't make any sense. And it was really important to me that everything Gertie said made sense. Like I didn't want Gertie to be this like outlier. It was just like, oh, well, this is crazy, and I'm going to stand in the way of things. It's not really where she's coming from. I mean, yes, she does impede the progress of the rebellion, but it's coming from a very real place of survival. Um, I feel like Gertie is the moral compass of the book. Um, and I have noticed that folks have very strong opinions about Gertie on both sides of the fence. But she's trying to survive. It's all she knows. It's all she knows, and there is nothing that has come across that has made sense to her as a way to be liberated. And so the idea of dying and coming back a monster, that is not a way out. It just isn't. It doesn't make any sense. Um, and she has to stop it. She has to, because if she doesn't, she loses everything again.
Honestly, I would be the coward myself. I'm afraid to, um,
Sure.
because it's an incredible risk, but there's also that fear of the unknown on the other side. And obviously, because this is a trilogy, correct?
Kind of. So they gave me a 3-book deal. Uh, so it is a series. So I'll be able to do 3. However, if the lovely folks out there that like to read enjoy those 3, I do have plans for more.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I mean, because it is going to continue on. You've set things up in a way that there's a lot of potential ground to cover, and and it isn't just as simple as we're going to defeat the people here who are oppressing us, because first it's the plantation, but then it's going to go beyond that, and there are going to be new challenges that arise. This won't just be as simple as we're going to take back our freedom, but we're thinking about everybody. I mean, that's where I see the hints going towards in terms of what's coming in book 2. And I won't ask you for teasers or anything like that. I know how that goes. But that's so it is an incredible change. And also, it's interesting that you say people have strong reactions to Gertie, because first there was the part of me that was like, you need to listen to him. Like, you do need to hear what he's saying, because it doesn't feel like you are really fully hearing him. But at the same time, once they make this decision, they're making it on behalf of everyone else who is working on that plantation. It's going to change everybody's lives, and that's kind of that's a really rather bold undertaking on behalf of all these other people who are afraid of change. And you delve into this without this being simply a case of putting people into two different camps. It isn't just the people who are for it and the people who are against it. You're looking at it from the perspective of people who are abused, people who are in the house and therefore immediate targets for violence in all forms, and so there are penalties to the others when somebody acts incorrectly. I mean, and so there are consequences, and for all of these people, and they're all and there's divisions within that. It's splintered even more. You have Irene's character, which I loved her character, and I mean, I didn't love the situation that she was in, obviously, but it shows how even within the slaves on this plantation, there are factions, and there are people who, there are people who put you into a different box based off of your circumstances, or in her case, she's biracial. Mm-hmm. So there's the whole, there are all these different ways of people being divided against each other rather than coming together to really deal with their primary oppressor. How strategic was it when you were planning that? And do you feel, based off of your research, do you feel that was something that that slave owners encouraged and fostered, trying to cause friction and division between?
Oh yeah. See, if you keep everybody separated, then they can't unite. Keep them all fighting amongst each other. There was a draft of the book in which one of the characters was brought in to see Big Jim and talk about what was going on, why Willie and Rafazi were missing, what happened. And Big Jim, he had his own version of what needed to be told. And he was going to use this character, Fuddle. He was going to use Fuddle to explain his version of what happened. And in return, he was going to make Fuddle a driver. On some plantations, you'd have a slave owner take one of the slaves and make him sort of a pseudo overseer. You got their food, lodging, clothing. And, when you're in a situation where there's the dominant society, and you're used to being downtrodden, even a little bit of something makes you feel better, feel good. And that's the insidiousness of colonization. You hold everybody down so that everybody's afflicted, and then you pick one up. You say, this is a good one. Put that one there. And then that person starts believing they are good. They are better. I'm better than you. Better because here I am. You're still there. And that was definitely something that happened on plantations. And it was something that on TV in the story, especially because, like you say with Irene, her entire existence was dependent upon how attractive, for lack of a more insidious term, Big Jim was or felt she was. And Quazo, Willie, having to rise above all of that because his ultimate goal is for everyone to be free, whether they take the blood or not. And that's a harder thing to do. So yeah, that stuff was stuff that I had seen, stuff that I had researched, and I did want to incorporate some of that just because I didn't want it to just be. I mean, listen, I don't really like slave narratives. It's all the same story. It's suffer, 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 die, or suffer, suffer, suffer. Brad Pitt shows up and says, "Hey guys, this isn't cool," and then die. I wanted to show a much more complex group of people, more complexity of character, more entirety of humanity within all of these films. Because they're going to be immortal. We're going to be with them for a while, so I didn't want them to cookie cutter. I did want to focus in on what they had to deal with, what they had to deal with, why they made the decisions they made. And again, it's a big decision. No disrespect to Stephanie Meyer, vampires aren't all sparkly. These are vicious creatures. They're monsters. And to say, I can either stay here and remain a slave, or I can become a monster, that's a heady thing. And it's gotta be because there's no survival. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's no other way forward. And but it's interesting when you're talking about wanting them to be, certainly very real, and also to really grapple with, I think, issues that don't just affect them. I mean, you have them forming a partnership of sorts with the indigenous peoples who originally lived on that land, and
Yeah.
and recognizing their loss and what they had endured as well, even though it was different, obviously, different dynamics. You still have them really recognizing that, and it was I find it. I really loved that piece of the story because it shows that they're thinking beyond themselves. They're thinking of everybody who is affected by colonization and oppression, and also that they are not. Sometimes there's, sometimes when things are going bad for you as an individual or for a group of people that you belong to, it can feel very isolating and like that's the only thing that's really consuming your thoughts. And then, but and then it's hard for you to understand that other people are also being oppressed. Sometimes, if you get locked in on what's going on with you and yourself or your people in different circumstances, like whether you're trans or whether you are autistic, or whether you belong to a different racial group, in this day and age, right now, you are under fire in different ways. And when everybody gets siloed, it's very hard for them to pull together to fight that joint oppressor. And you have that paralleled in what you've already talked about in terms of the different groups within the slaves. But now you also have this mirrored in terms of them joining forces with the indigenous people, and recognizing that we've all suffered here and we all want better and we all promise to do right by each other, which is really a beautiful sentiment. Where did you come up with the idea that you wanted to include Indigenous characters and touch on this?
There's, to me, there's really no way of telling the story of the history of this land without speaking about the indigenous. There's just no way of doing it. I mean, yeah, people have done it, but it's not right. They they were here, Native Americans, indigenous tribes. So to ignore that, I think is criminal. And you know, if we're talking about current time, we're on their land. United States of America is on their land. They're not even part of the conversation. They're not even part of the conversation. Race, this country, and it's like I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't know how you can. It's really weird to me how there's this huge push against immigration. You are not indigenous. That's how it happens. That's how you got here. I am sorry if you are European, of European descent, and you are here, you immigrated. If you are of African descent, you were stolen and brought here as luggage of the immigrants. So to be like, go back to where you came from. There's a whole group of folks that are here, that were here, that belong here, that deserve to be recognized and respected as such. So for me, there was just no way of telling the story without including them. I mean, obviously, I am of African descent, so I'm telling that story, but there's just no way. Those and tiny spoiler that continues.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm glad that it continues.
Yeah. No way, you can't ignore it. Just, so that was then, and then I wanted to double back when you were discussing Gertie and like the different factions within the plantation. That was also intentional, specifically the relationship between Willie and Gertie. Also, because the other thing that the book is a new origin story for the vampire, to also be expanded upon in the next book. But look, I dig vampires; they're great, but usually they're like 300 or 400-year-old dudes, and they're like got really cool leather coats, and they're like kind of miserable until they see a teenage girl, and then it's like, okay, that's my reason for living now. I gotta go scam on this miner, which is creepy to me. So I wanted to have a much more realistic romantic relationship, one that was difficult. And so you see Willie and Gertie butting heads because, they both feel so deeply for one another, but they also feel so deeply for their chosen options of how to go forward. And that clashes, and they clash as much as they do because they care for each other as much as they do. But it's not the typical sort of sweeping vampire romance thing. And I wanted to do something that was much more realistic, something that, hopefully people could feel, people could recognize pieces of their own relationship in the two of them. Because they love each other desperately, but they're also desperate. And this decision nearly tears them apart.
Well, they have a very realistic relationship, in my opinion. It goes way beyond just a romantic liaison, anything like that. They really do love each other and care about each other. And even when they see things differently, they're going to argue it out. And they're, and giving up is not something that comes quickly to either of them. They are, they're committed. And so and that's actually also, I think, really reassuring, even when you have people who are choosing different options, that they can still find a way to stand together, which is an interesting message as well, that we don't all have to do this and approach this the same way, but we can all work together to get to the same end result, which is freedom, whether that is taking the blood or not taking the blood. So that's how I viewed it, in reading it.
It's the 9 rule. Have you heard of the 9 rule? So the 9 rule basically says, if you think 8 plus 1 is 9, you're right. But you'll argue until you're red in the face with the person that thinks 3 plus 3 plus 3 is 9. And they will argue with the person that thinks 5 plus 4 is 9. And they'll argue with the person that thinks 7 plus 2 is 9. Everyone's right. Everyone's right. Everyone's trying to get to 9. But there are different ways of doing it, and they all get you where you need to go. So it's really about respecting, recognizing the commonality of goals, and then respecting the different ways of getting. And that's what I try to get the characters to.
No, that's a great way of putting it. I don't think I've ever heard it put quite like that before, but it illustrates it perfectly. So I was curious, where did the Ramangan lore originate? I did a little Google search and I was like, oh, there's, because I'll admit, I'm not like I'm certainly not an authority on vampire lore. Not even remotely. So Crowns of Nyaxia, but like I've never read Twilight. So I'm aware there's glittery vampires, but that's about as far as it goes. So right. Where did the Ramangan lore originate? What inspired you to go in this direction with the vampire lore in the story?
Well, so okay, I'm going to try to make this as succinct as possible. I was writing an entirely different vampire story before I started on this. And that one is based on a 1994 movie, I believe, called Regarding Henry. It's the Harrison Ford movie. This is like where the
Harrison Ford movie? Okay.
Yeah, that's where it all starts. So 1990. Yeah, it's wild. Like, this is wild. So 1994, I see this movie Regarding Henry, and Harrison Ford is this high-powered attorney, but he's a dick. And then he gets shot, and he gets in a coma. He comes out of the coma, and he has amnesia. And he has no idea who he used to be. And now he's this really cool dude. And then he starts finding out what an awful person he used to be. It's to change it. So this gets stuck in my brain, and I start thinking about how can I do a version of Regarding Henry. Like, what would be interesting? Like, who would be an interesting person to have amnesia? And so the idea occurred to me, what if somehow a vampire could have amnesia and forget all of his years as a vampire and only remember the human years? And have no idea that for centuries you were this horrific monster. Right? So that's what I was working on. I was working on that. And then George Floyd gets murdered. And everyone is so angry, and they're marching in the streets. And I'm mad at the people who are mad because we're in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone is telling us we need to stop the spread. And it was like this whole thing with George Floyd, horrendous. It wasn't new. We had a black president, and cops are killing black people in their cars and in their homes. and there was no big vitriol for them. It was George Floyd in the middle of a pandemic, with Trump in office. And now everybody basically just has a reason to go outside, which means we get to have COVID for another however many years because nobody wants to pay attention to anything. George Floyd wasn't a person, in my opinion. George Floyd was a righteous reason. Go off and do whatever you felt like doing. And that pissed me off. And on the opposite side of that, you've got Kyle Rittenhouse, right? So he goes off and murders some folks the next town over, but he's a martyr. And in the end, George Floyd's dead. Kyle Rittenhouse is alive and coming out with a book. And I thought, if there was an actual system, neither one of these people, George wouldn't be dead. Kyle wouldn't be, it would be a whole different situation. It was just very frustrating. And I tell my wife, and she knows I'm working on this thing. And she says to me, it's too bad your vampires can't go back in time and fix everything from the get-go. That's how it happened. So that's the overview of how the whole story started. So now I know I'm going to go back in time with vampires. Now I know that I don't want them to be European. So I want to create an entirely new vampire. So I started looking into vampire lore around the world. Like, how did different cultures interpret this character? And then I found out about the folks in Madagascar, and they had a Ramangan, which was their vampire creature that would eat the nails of nobles. And I just thought Ramangan was the coolest word I'd ever seen. And so I co-opted Ramangan from Madagascar and created my lore around it. I wanted it to be very, very close, similar to what we know vampires to be, because I didn't want it to be difficult for a reader to get into it. I didn't want it to be so far off that you couldn't really get into the story because you're trying to figure all this vampire stuff out that was new and different. But I did want it to have its small little differences. And so as you go through the book, you recognize there's something about blood and how it operates, how emotions fuel things, fuel power, that type of thing. So I was able to sort of create my own version of a vampire and have that creature be in Africa, originate in West Africa. And there's more to it that will also go into.
Yes, I'm sure we'll learn more in the next books as we go on, because there were some definitely, although there were pieces that I recognized because you did have some of those same foundational similarities, there were also differences that were introduced, and they were definitely surprising and intriguing. And I'm very curious to see where things go with some of those elements from the story. So
there are hints in the first chapter.
Really? Yeah, I always find it fascinating when you go back and you reread something and you go, "Oh, I missed this the first time through," right? Because you don't have the whole picture, and sometimes you're just looking so hard at specific details that other things are just, going right by you. So, I'm going to have to go back and reread that chapter and see what I pick up on that didn't, necessarily connect the dots with when I was reading it.
Right. Yeah, there are definite hints into what's going on.
If you were back in time in this world that you have created, would you follow Quadzo or Gertie?
I'd like to believe I would follow Quadzo. I would like to believe that. I like to believe it's difficult. I mean, what's your choice? Your choice is death or death.
Yeah.
That's your choice. So one death is unknown. Another death you're being told is a bloody, horrific one. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's the question, right? Like, I mean, that's the big overarching question of the book. Like, which would you choose? I'd like to think that I would like to think that I would make that leap, make that, you know, uh, the horrendousness, the insidiousness of it, and then the fact that despite all of it, you're still dependent on these slave owners. And the consequences for anything, not knowing what's going to set off a round of torture and violence, and knowing that if you run, they're coming after you. They're coming after these dogs. And I mean, I can't imagine a day-to-day life like that, But yes, I want to believe that I would follow myself.
Well, you have these discussion questions at the end of the book, and it is really thought-provoking because making choices is a big theme throughout the book. And I think we all would like to think that we would do the right thing under certain circumstances. That if I walked outside, well, okay, I live on a farm, so it wouldn't exactly happen like this. But if I didn't, and I walked outside and saw a police officer who was assaulting a black man, I'd like to think that I would, pick up my phone and I would record it and I would, call them out and try to affect change and protect this person's life. But when you're in the situation, you don't know how you'll respond to fear. And so I think that there's that element of it as well, because obviously we can't visit with each of there's about 300 slaves on the plantation. And so we don't get inside everyone's mind in terms of what they're thinking, but undoubtedly that's a factor for some people as well. So we would like to think we would be the courageous person. In the moment, you don't know how you're going to respond. You never know until you're there. So,
right. Well, you're talking about two different things in any given situation, even the one that you just proposed with yourself. I mean, it is fear, but then there's also consequence. A friend of mine, a bunch of us were hanging out back in the day in a car. Car gets pulled over. Cops pull me, driver, out, put us on the hood of the car, frisking us, cuffing us. We were the black guys. One of the white guys starts yelling at the cops, accusing them of racism. Why are you going to mess with them? You're going to mess with them because they're black? And he genuinely thought he was helping. But he was just making it worse for us. It was worse for us because the more he'd yell, he's not going to get pulled out of the car. They're just going to take that frustration out on us that they already have in their hands. And we're literally telling it, shut up. You're not helping. Just shut up. If we can just get through this and they can leave because we haven't done anything wrong, then we'll be fine. But, consequence, fear. What's going to happen? Where is this going to go? Like, there's no way of knowing. And then there's also just belief. In order to follow Rafazo, you have to believe that what they're saying is true. And, some of the slaves on the plantation had heard the stories of Ramangan. The tribe had been out. No one knew it was gone. Like, okay, so it's been hundreds of years. I mean, that's 300 years. Is it real? Is it real? Did these people exist? You weren't there. It's 300 years ago. What if you do this thing and you're just dead? You made this choice. Now you're just dead. Like, who knows? Who knows? So, to me, I found it to be a very interesting situation because there's this huge leap of faith that you have to take in order to make the decision to take Ramangan blood. And again, like I said at the outset, you don't even think about something that you have no knowledge of if your current situation isn't beyond atrocious. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah. It's horrific and it's heavy and it is really thought provoking because there's a lot that you sit with after reading through the story and thinking about what you would do in different circumstances.
Right.
And it's interesting that you point out the consequences because, most of the white people in the story are evil incarnate, really, I think I would say. But there's one guy who's not so bad, and yet his actions still have interesting consequences for him, and I just thought that was it was so interesting because it was like even wanting to do the right thing and actually doing the right thing. I mean, it just goes to show that there's no guarantees of what's going to happen on the other side. I don't want to give away what I don't, but you know who I'm talking about, obviously.
Yes, I do.
Oh,
yeah. I didn't want there to be, as so often happens in these stories, I didn't want there to be a white savior. And so, yes, were there white folks during the time of slavery who were against slavery? Absolutely, there were. The abolitionist movement was real, all of that. However, the average slave on the average plantation never met a good white person. The average slave on the average plantation only knew the overseer and the slave owner who owned them and ordered their torture because they weren't allowed to leave. In many cases, they weren't even allowed to talk to other slaves in other plantations. All they said. They didn't see anything else. So, for this story, I decided that there would not be an ally or a savior. I wanted their liberation to come from this power, from their homeland. Their land was stolen from them, but the blood remained. And that became what freed them. Once that is in place, now we can start introducing new characters, different characters, better characters. But I wanted for Quadzo and his people to be freed by the magic of West African blood.
Oh, I think it's really important as well as, like you're saying, there is this tendency, particularly, I think, when white people write the story, write it with a white savior, and you most certainly do not have that. I have to say that when we were approaching the point where they were going to take the slaves to church, I'm just going to say I really wasn't expecting. I was like, where is this going? And then, I wasn't expecting that. And yet at the same time, like, I guess I wouldn't really be surprised if that, if that was like ripped right out of the pages of history.
It was.
Yeah. That's
sermon that the slaves of the Barrow Plantation got is the one thing in the book that I did not write. So I, in my research, saw interviews that were had with slaves. Um, and so they just sort of like, it was this big long list of just like written interviews. And they discussed all manner of situation. And then the question of religion. Like, what were you taught about religion? And so several of the slaves in the interviews included things that were said to them by preachers or, religious whoever. Um, and so I took those things and reorganized them into a single sermon. But those were things that were said to the slaves via these interviews.
Yeah, there's such a thing as spiritual abuse, and this is it in a nutshell. I mean, I've seen it manifested in different ways, um, uh, in this current time. But it also all of a sudden makes you realize why it is that so many people who claim to be religious are supporting some horrific actions now in this current time. So, without delving into politics. Um, so, yeah, that could be a whole other subject to discuss. But we should really try to wrap it up here because I've taken up so much of your time, and I really do appreciate you discussing this book. And I also want to, it's important to, I think, really delve into the issues that you're raising in this book. This is a book that I don't feel, I there's that discourse about, reading with your brain switched off. And this is not a book that you should approach that way. I don't think it's a book that you can approach that way, but I also don't think it's a book that you should approach that way. I think it's a book that is meant to be inspiring and thought-provoking. And you're using the form of fiction to cast this light on what was going on and aspects of the story that we aren't told as much because, like you said, there tends to be this emphasis on the Civil War and the 1800s more when people tell slave stories, and so you're taking us in a different direction. So I wondered, what is it that you hope that readers will take away from the experience of reading Blood Slaves? I mean, what do you hope that a reader like me would take away? What do you hope that other readers would take away?
Personal power. The whole thing with the Ramangan blood is that it's personal power. It's power that you can call upon and embrace to propel you forward, because embracing that gives you the confidence to allow others to do the same. But yeah, I want people to understand that their power is always there and it's always available.
If you could play one of the characters, Blood Slaves, which character would you want to play?
Rafazi.
Really?
Yeah, Rafazi. I dig Rafazi, and he's a complicated dude, and Rafazi, I think, because Rafazi has to go against his nature to help this thing happen. He's got to do the thing that he avoided his entire existence, which is be a mentor, be a teacher. And he has to understand his power more than he's ever had to, because he's got to now impart it onto Willie. He's got to basically set Willie up for success because he knows he can't do it. He doesn't have it in him. And yet, he's sort of the father of this rebellion. I mean, he's his blood fuels it all. It's a very interesting situation to be in, I think, to have this guy who gets told in 1407, hey, there's a plague killing us all. You need to tell everybody. You need to refrain. And he goes, gotcha. For centuries. You know, like, you know, and then instead of just running off when he finally does get to, what if I did this? What if I did this because I see something in this guy, something that I do not see in myself? I did this, and I think that's a really interesting, creatively active. So I would want to.
I do think he's a great character, but also I do think it's interesting that what happened to him earlier on in the 1400s, he didn't seem to have the really a sense of loyalty and community. I mean, he had the one who turned him, and that he refers to throughout, you know, who he assumes is gone. But beyond that, he didn't really have any point of connection, it seemed, or much of a connection to the other Ramangans at the time.
Right.
But
Right.
in what happens now in the 1700s, he is creating a family unit, a community, and that community includes all shapes and sizes, because it includes the indigenous people, it includes people who don't take the blood, it includes those who do, but he's embracing all of that and building that sense of community and loyalty, which is such an interesting. Even though he is not the protagonist. I mean, Willie Quazzo is the main character, but it's such an interesting growth arc for him. So I can see the reason that you would want to be him if you were to play.
It's kind of like Morpheus in the Matrix. Like a reluctant Morpheus.
Sometimes the reluctant heroes are the most interesting ones, really. So
Yeah.
and of course, and then we also have the very loyal Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie.
Yeah,
You love Charlie.
yeah, he's a great character. So I think you were including him. It was just, it was really fun to see him incorporated into the story, but to also have his moment without giving anything specific away. So
Right.
I really enjoyed that. I really, like I said to you before we started filming, enjoy is a hard word to apply to this book because it is very heavy, and there are a lot of horrific things that happen. But through it all, it is very empowering in the sense that you're showing people who survive these horrific things and don't give up. They come through on the other side in all their own different ways. They're going to fight for better, and they don't quit, which is I think a really important message for today. So, well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about your book, and it comes out July 29th. Is that correct?
But yes, the book is releasing on July 29th. The hardcover, the ebook, and the audiobook will all release on the same day. And I have been invited to record the letter to the readers and the acknowledgments.
It's fantastic that you get the opportunity to do that, because not everybody gets to contribute to their audiobook. So that's wonderful. But also, you said in your interview with your editor that you get emotional reading that letter. How are you feeling about actually going in to record it? Because there's a lot of emotion behind it.
There is. We'll see what happens. I'm very excited to do it. We'll see how it goes. I will take some time to read some pieces of it aloud today. It's an emotional book. was an emotional journey to write it. And now that people are reading it, I'm learning that they are having their own emotional journey through it. So I have dispensed with my fear of emotion. I'm very excited to read it, and I hope I get through it. Not sure there'll be another take. I can do it in another take. But yeah, it's very personal to me, obviously, and in the acknowledgments as well as my wife and her piece in the creation of this story. Um, and yeah, I'd rather be the one to say that stuff.
I hope that people pick up Blood Slaves, and I hope that they find it to be as powerful and insightful as I did. I know it's a learning process, but I am rooting for all of, well, how do I put this so I don't get into spoilers? I'm rooting for all of the right survivors. How about that? I'm rooting for all of them, and I'm so curious to see what's going to happen. We haven't talked about them, but I'm curious to see what's going to happen with Derby. There's a few others, so I'm really curious to see what the and so no, I won't beg you for spoilers, but I hope people find it to be as captivating and insightful as I did, um, and it's a fantastic action-packed story. It is a difficult read in places, but it is powerful and important. And it is important for us to look at this time in history and to really acknowledge what happened. And you're bringing that to us through the power of fiction, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Sandra. That's very kind. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I really do.
Thank you.
It's there, and you sit in a little room and you write all of this stuff, and you know, you hope anybody else pick it up and connect with it.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you, Sandra.